The distress beacon had been silent for 11 years, 4 months and 7 days, which meant the last surviving alien child on the dusty planet below had either finally learned how to turn off a broken transmitter or had simply stopped believing anyone would ever answer. Lieutenant Kaelen Voss didn't know which possibility terrified him more as he pushed his battered dropship through the upper atmosphere of a world whose name no one in command had bothered to remember. The beacon's original signal had arrived at Earth when Kaelen was 7 years old, sitting cross-legged on his bedroom floor, assembling a plastic model of a starship he'd never imagined would one day become his coffin. The Galactic Compact, a coalition of 14 advanced species, had sent out a distress call from a remote research colony on the fringe of the Orion Spur. Then silence. Then evacuation orders. Then, as the Compact's bureaucracy ground its gears through the slow machinery of intergalactic protocol, 17 years of nothing. 17 years of children waiting in the dark. Kaelen's hands moved across the controls with muscle memory that had become reflex. The ship shuddered, heat shielding glowing cherry red through the forward viewport as atmosphere clawed at his hull. His destination was a speck on old star charts, a moonless planet with an unpronounceable designation that his onboard computer had helpfully translated as the Garden, a name that had become a joke the moment the Compact lost contact. "Approaching landing zone," Kaelen said, though there was no one to hear him. The comms were dead, had been dead for the last 3 jumps. He was alone out here, 3 weeks past the point where any reasonable pilot would have turned back, running on emergency rations and the kind of stubborn hope that only humans seemed capable of mistaking for strategy. The beacon flickered to life on his sensors. Not the old distress signal that had degraded into white noise years ago. This was something new, something deliberate. A tight beam transmission aimed directly at his descending ship, as if whoever was down there had been watching him fall through the void and had been waiting for this exact moment. The message was short. 4 words in a language his translation matrix struggled to parse, the syntax archaic, the grammar broken as if pieced together from half-remembered lessons. "You alone, confirm, please." Alone. Confirm. Kaelen's throat tightened. The please was what got him. The desperate politeness of someone who had learned that begging didn't work, but couldn't quite stop themselves from adding one last courtesy. He keyed his response, broadcasting on every frequency he could access. "This is Lieutenant Kaelen Voss, United Earth Corps. I'm receiving your signal. I'm descending to your location. Do you have a safe landing site?" The silence stretched for 30 agonizing seconds. Then the beacon pulsed again, this time with coordinates and a single trembling word. 17. Not a number, a name. The garden's surface was a study in beautiful violence. Once it had lived up to its translation: dense jungles, phosphorescent fungi, rivers that sang with bioluminescent life. Now, the landscape was scarred by impact craters and the blackened skeletons of structures that had been vaporized years ago. The Compact's research colony had been a jewel of xenobotany, a place where a dozen species had come to study the planet's extraordinary ecosystem. Then the raiders had come. Then the Compact had pulled their military assets to a more profitable front. Then the children had been left behind. Kaelen set his ship down on a stretch of cracked permacrete that might once have been a landing pad. The engines whined as they powered down, and in the sudden silence he heard something that made his blood run cold. Music. Faint, distorted, drifting through the hull of his ship as if the atmosphere itself was carrying a tune. It was old, ancient even, a lullaby from a species he didn't recognize, played on instruments that had probably been dust for centuries. But beneath the melody, woven into the harmony like a scar tissue over a wound, was a second song. Human, a recording of a woman's voice, humming something soft and sad and unbearably familiar. His mother had hummed that tune. On the night he'd told her he was enlisting, when she'd known that he was going somewhere she couldn't follow. Kaelen slammed the hatch release before he could talk himself out of it. The air hit him like a wall of wet cotton, breathable, barely, with a metallic aftertaste that coated his tongue. The sky was the color of a bruise, and the light that filtered through the clouds was amber and wrong, casting long shadows, that seemed to move independently of their sources. He stepped onto the permacrete, pulse rifle up but not aimed, and saw them. They emerged from the ruins like ghosts learning to be solid again. The first was tall, nearly 7 feet, with skin the color of deep space, scattered with pinprick bioluminescent spots that pulsed in slow, synchronized rhythms. Its limbs were too long, its joints too many, and it moved with a fluid grace that suggested its bones were made of something closer to liquid than calcium. It wore a tattered remnant of what might once have been a uniform, now patched with alien fabrics and what looked disturbingly like cured leather. Behind it came the others, 7 of them in total, ranging from the tall one's height down to a creature barely 3 feet high, with 4 arms and a face that was all eyes, huge and wet and terrified. They were children, all of them. Even the tall one, whose movements held the uncoordinated eagerness of adolescence, whose spots flickered too fast, too bright, betraying an emotional state that Kaelen's training identified as desperate, fragile hope. The translation matrix in his helmet struggled to keep up as the tall one spoke. Its voice was a cascade of clicks and modulated tones, but the words that emerged from his speakers were halting, imperfect, and heartbreakingly clear. You are not the Compact. Not a question, an observation. Kaelen lowered his rifle. No, I'm not. The Compact said they would send ships, many ships, with soldiers and food and medicine. They said we would be rescued within the year. The tall one's spots dimmed. That was 17 years ago. We stopped counting after the first 5. I'm sorry, Kaelen said, and meant it with a ferocity that surprised him. I'm all that's coming. The small one with too many eyes let out a sound that his translator rendered as a single, devastating word. Why? Kaelen didn't have a good answer. The truth was ugly and simple. The Compact had deemed the colony a loss, the children collateral damage, and the political cost of a rescue mission too high. Earth had heard the original distress call, but had no jurisdiction in Compact space. By the time anyone on Earth had realized the Compact wasn't going back, the trail had gone cold. Except for one obsessive long-shot investigation by a junior xenopologist named Dr. Aris Thorne, who had tracked the beacon's faint echo through 17 years of corrupted data streams, who had finally identified a single survivor signal buried in the noise, who had spent his last savings to hire a human pilot crazy enough to make the jump. The pilot was Kaelen. The xenopologist was currently frozen in a cryopod in the ship's cargo bay, because Aris was 73 years old and his heart wouldn't survive the journey's radiation exposure. Kaelen was the only one awake, the only one who could come. I'm here to take you home, Kaelen said. All of you. My ship isn't big, but it'll hold you. We'll have to make 2 trips, maybe 3, but I have supplies and... The tall one's spots flashed white. No. Kaelen stopped. No. There are complications. The tall one turned to look back at the ruins, and for the first time Kaelen noticed the structure behind them. Not a building, a shelter. Something cobbled together from wreckage and salvaged Compact technology, reinforced with what looked like woven plant fiber and the structural bones of some native megafauna. It was huge, sprawling, and entirely too large for only 7 children. How many of you are there? Kaelen asked slowly. The tall one's name, he learned, was Jelen. She was the eldest, the de facto leader, the one who had kept the others alive through starvation, disease, and the raiders who had returned 3 times over the years, each time taking more of what little the children had managed to rebuild. There were 43 survivors in total, 43 children, ranging in age from the equivalent of 4 human years to 17. 43 mouths to feed, bodies to clothe, minds to keep from shattering under the weight of what they had endured. Kaelen did the math in his head. His ship could carry 12, maybe 15 if he stripped the emergency equipment and flew without safety margins. The others, he said. Where are they? Jelen led him into the shelter, and Kaelen's heart broke in ways he hadn't known it could still break. The interior was a masterclass in desperate engineering. Walls made from ship hulls and cargo containers, sealed with a resin that smelled faintly of burnt sugar and solidified into something harder than steel. A central atrium had been carved out, and in its center a fire burned, Not chemical, not electrical, but something organic, a glowing fungal colony that produced heat and soft violet light. And everywhere, children. They looked up as he entered, and Kaelen saw the full spectrum of hope's damage in their alien eyes. Some lit up with joy so pure it hurt. Others stared with flat, wary suspicion, their bodies tensed for flight or violence. A few didn't look up at all, too lost in their own private darkness to notice that a stranger had entered their world. The youngest, a creature with iridescent scales and vestigial wings that would never fly, crawled toward him on 6 legs and wrapped itself around his boot. It didn't speak. It just held on, trembling, as if Kaelen were the first warm thing it had touched in years. "What happened to your parents?" Kaelen asked, though he already knew the answer. "The raiders took them first," Jelen said quietly. "The researchers tried to protect us. They hid us in the underground labs, told us to stay quiet no matter what we heard. Then they went out to negotiate." Her spots went dark. "There was no negotiation. The raiders didn't want hostages. They wanted specimens. The adults were valuable. The children were too young to be worth the transport costs." Kaelen's grip on his rifle tightened until his knuckles ached. "They left us," Jelen continued. "After they took everyone over a certain age, they left. We thought the compact would come. They had to come. We were citizens. We mattered." A pause. "We were wrong." The smallest child, the one wrapped around his boot, made a sound like a broken music box. Kaelen looked down and saw that its scales were changing color, cycling through a pattern that his translator identified as the equivalent of tears. He knelt, slowly, and placed a hand on the child's back. It flinched, then leaned into the touch, its entire body shaking with silent sobs. "I'm not leaving you here," Kaelen said, and he meant it. He didn't know how, didn't know if it was even possible, but he meant it with every fiber of his being. "I'm going to get you all out, every single one of you. I swear it." A child near the back, a lanky, angular creature with too many teeth and eyes that reflected light like a cat's, spoke for the first time. Its voice was a rasp, as if its vocal cords had been damaged and never properly healed. "You swear?" it said. "The Compact swore. They swore on their ancestors and their gods and their honor. Their oaths meant nothing." Kaelen met its gaze. "I'm not Compact, I'm human. What's the difference?" The question hung in the air, sharp and honest. Kaelen had no answer that would satisfy a child who had been betrayed by every adult it had ever trusted. So he didn't try. He stood up and walked to the center of the atrium, where the fungal fire cast its soft violet glow over faces that had seen too much and expected nothing. "My name is Kaelen Voss," he said, loud enough for all of them to hear. "I came from a planet called Earth, 17,000 light-years from here, because a man named Aris Thorn refused to let your story end in silence. I have a ship with enough fuel for 3 trips. I have emergency rations that will last maybe 2 weeks if we stretch them. I have no backup, no reinforcements, and no plan." He paused, letting the weight of his honesty settle over them. "But I also have 43 reasons to figure this out. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to stay here for the next 24 hours, and I'm going to learn everything I can about this shelter, your resources, and this planet. Then I'm going to take the youngest and the sickest on the first trip, get them to a safe location, and come back for the rest. It's going to take time. It's going to be dangerous. And it's going to require every single one of you to trust me, even though every instinct you have is screaming at you not to." The angular child with the damaged voice stared at him. "And if we don't trust you?" Kaelen shrugged. "Then I'll earn it." He worked through the night. The children showed him their systems, the water reclamation unit that Jelen had pieced together from salvaged compactors and atmospheric processors, the hydroponic garden that produced barely enough edible fungus to keep them alive, the medical bay that was really just a corner of the shelter where the injured went to die slowly, because no one had the training or supplies to help them. He met them all, learning names that his tongue struggled to pronounce and faces that his memory would never forget. Vec, the angular one with the damaged voice, who had been 8 when the raiders came and had watched his mother dragged away. Sora, a soft-bodied creature who communicated through color shifts and had become the shelter's unofficial therapist, soothing nightmares she couldn't understand. The scaled child who had wrapped itself around his boot, its name was Chur, and it was barely 3 years old, too young to remember anything except the darkness. He also learned about the raiders. They came every few months, Jelen explained. Not to the shelter, the children had learned to hide their presence too well for that, but to the planet's surface, searching for anything of value left behind by the Compact. They were a nomadic species, traders in flesh and technology, with no allegiance to any government or code of ethics. They had stripped the colony of everything portable years ago, but they still returned, hunting for salvage, for data, for anything that could be sold. "They don't know we're here," Vex said, and there was a strange edge to his voice. "If they found us." "They won't," Kaelen said. "I'll make sure of it." He should have asked more questions. Should have noticed the way Vec looked at the other children when he said that, the subtle shift in body language that suggested not all of them agreed on the raiders' ignorance. But Kaelen was tired, running on adrenaline and the dregs of his emergency stimulants, and he let the details slip past him. It was a mistake he would regret for the rest of his life. Dawn, or what passed for dawn on the garden, came with a sound that turned Kaelen's blood to ice. Ship engines. Not his, not Compact. Something bigger, uglier, with a roar that rattled his teeth in his skull. The children reacted instantly. Jelen began issuing orders in a rapid stream of clicks and whistles, her spots flashing warning red. The smaller children were scooped up and carried deeper into the shelter, while the older ones took positions at what Kaelen now recognized as defensive points. Dark corners with clear lines of fire, salvaged weapons that looked like they might still work. "Get down!" Jelen hissed, grabbing Kaelen's arm and pulling him toward a recessed alcove. "Don't move, don't make a sound. They scan for heat signatures and movement. If they find you—" "If they find me, I'll kill them," Kaelen said flatly. Jelen's grip tightened. "There are 30 of them. They have ship-to-ground weaponry and armor that can withstand your human projectiles. You will die, and then they will find us, and everything we have survived will have been for nothing." Kaelen looked at her, really looked, past the alien features and the bioluminescent spots, and saw a 17-year-old who had been holding her family together through sheer force of will since she was old enough to understand what together meant. "Okay," he said, "we do this your way for now." The raiders landed half a kilometer from the shelter. Kaelen watched through a crack in the shelter's wall as the ship settled onto the permacrete, a blocky utilitarian vessel covered in scorch marks and what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The ramp lowered, and the creatures that emerged were nothing like the Compact's polished diplomats. They were tall, bipedal, with exoskeletons that gleamed like oil slicks, and faces that were all mandibles and too many eyes. They carried weapons that hummed with barely contained energy, and they moved with the lazy confidence of predators who had never encountered prey that could fight back. One of them, the largest, with scars crisscrossing its carapace, stopped at the edge of the landing zone and tilted its head, as if listening to something Kaelen couldn't hear. "They're tracking something," Vec whispered from behind Kaelen. The angular child had somehow materialized at his elbow, silent as a shadow. "They always do that when they're close. They can smell us. Not our bodies, our fear. It has a chemical signature they can detect from 100 meters. Kaelen's hand went to his sidearm. "How do you know that?" Vec's damaged voice dropped even lower. "Because we've been running from them for 17 years. And because some of us—" he hesitated. "Some of us have been close enough to learn." Before Kaelen could ask what that meant, the largest raider pointed directly at the shelter. Not at the entrance, at the specific section of wall where Kaelen was hidden. "They know," Jelen breathed, and her voice was the sound of hope dying. "They've always known, they were just waiting." Kaelen didn't wait for an explanation. He shoved Vec toward the deeper part of the shelter, raised his sidearm, and stepped out into the open. The raiders froze, all 30 of them, their weapons tracking onto him with mechanical precision. The largest one, the leader, Kaelen assumed, took a step forward and made a sound that his translator rendered as laughter. "A human," it said, its voice a wet, chittering thing. "Alone, on this dead world, How pathetic. Kaelen didn't lower his weapon. These children are under my protection. You will leave this planet immediately, or I will consider your presence an act of war against the United Earth Corps. The laughter grew louder, spreading through the raiders like a contagion. Your corpse is 17,000 light-years away, little mammal. You have no ships, no reinforcements, no power here. You are meat with delusions of relevance. The leader took another step. Step aside. The specimens are ours. They have always been ours. We simply allowed them to mature before harvesting. The word harvesting landed like a blade between Kaelen's ribs. He looked past the raiders into the shelter, where 43 children were watching him with wide, terrified eyes. He thought of cheer wrapped around his boot, of Jelen's 17 years of desperate hope, of Vec's damaged voice and the horrors it hinted at. He thought of his mother, humming that lullaby, knowing he was going somewhere she couldn't follow. "No," Kaelen said. The leader's mandibles clicked in irritation. "No." I said no. Kaelen raised his sidearm and sighted along the barrel. "You want these children? You go through me." For a moment, nothing happened. The raiders stared at him and Kaelen stared back, and the silence was filled with the weight of 43 held breaths. Then the leader made a sound that might have been respect or might have been disgust. "You will die for nothing," it said, "but if you insist on making a corpse of yourself, far be it from me to deny you the honor." It raised its weapon, and something exploded. Not the shelter, the raiders' ship. A secondary explosion ripped through its hull, sending shards of metal screaming through the air. The raiders scattered, their formation breaking as they turned to face this new threat. Kaelen didn't waste the opportunity. He fired 3 shots in rapid succession, each one finding a gap in a raider's exoskeleton. 2 went down. The third stumbled, its weapon firing wild, and Kaelen was already moving, diving behind a pile of rubble as return fire chewed up the ground where he'd been standing. More explosions, more chaos. And through it all, a sound that Kaelen hadn't expected to hear again for weeks, the distinctive whine of his own ship's engines. The cargo bay door was open, and standing in the opening, wrapped in a thermal blanket and looking like death warmed over, was Dr. Eris Thorne. The old xenopologist had a plasma rifle in his hands, salvaged from the ship's emergency locker, Kaelen realized, the one he'd told Aris not to touch under any circumstances, and he was firing into the raiders with the wild, inaccurate enthusiasm of a man who had never held a weapon in his life and didn't particularly care. "Kaelen," Aris shouted, his voice crackling over the open comm. "I may have miscalculated the cryosedation duration. Also, there are a lot of them." "I noticed," Kaelen yelled back, popping up from behind the rubble to fire another shot. Another raider fell. "How did you get out of the pod?" "The ship's computer detected the raiders' vessel and woke me up. Said something about imminent threat protocols." Aris fired again, missed spectacularly, and ducked back into the cargo bay. "I don't suppose you have a plan." Kaelen looked at the shelter, at the children, at the raiders who were regrouping, their initial shock giving way to cold, efficient fury. He had a plan. It was insane, probably suicidal, and guaranteed to fail in at least 14 different ways. But it was the only plan he had. "Get everyone on the ship," Kaelen shouted. "All of them, now." Jelen heard him. She didn't hesitate, just started pushing children toward the cargo bay, her spots flashing commands that her family obeyed without question. The scaled ones, the soft-bodied ones, the ones with too many limbs and not enough eyes. They all ran, pouring out of the shelter in a flood of terror and desperate hope. The raiders saw them, turned, raised their weapons. Kaelen stood up and walked directly into their line of fire. He didn't shoot, didn't dodge. He just walked, hands slightly raised, body an invitation and a challenge all at once. "You want them?" he called out. "You go through me. That was the deal. I haven't moved." The leader stared at him, and for the first time, Kaelen saw something other than contempt in those too many eyes. Confusion, uncertainty. The raider had faced soldiers before, had killed things far more dangerous than a lone human with a sidearm, but it had never faced someone who simply refused to be afraid. "Why?" the leader asked, and the question was almost genuine. Kaelen smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "Because I made a promise," he said, "and humans don't break promises." Behind him, the last of the children scrambled up the cargo ramp. Aris was counting, his voice a frantic litany of numbers. Zelen was at the ramp's edge, reaching out to Kaelen, her spots a desperate, pulsing white. "Kaelen! Now!" Kaelen didn't move. The raider leader raised its weapon. "You have wasted my time, mammal, and my patience. You will die, and the specimens will die, and your bones will bleach on this dead world until the sun goes cold." "Maybe," Kaelen said, "but not today." He triggered the remote detonator in his pocket. The charges he'd planted around the shelter's fungal core, the ones he'd set while inspecting the children's systems, the ones he'd never told anyone about, went off in a cascading chain of fire and light. The explosion wasn't aimed at the raiders. It was aimed at the ground beneath their feet. The permacrete cracked, then shattered, then collapsed, sending the raiders tumbling into the chasm that had been hidden beneath the landing zone for 17 years, a geothermal vent, long dormant, but now opened by Kaelen's explosives. The children had known it was there, had built their shelter on its edge using its residual heat to warm their home, but they'd never had the means to weaponize it. Kaelen did. The raiders fell screaming, their exoskeletons cracking against the vent's jagged walls. The leader managed to grab a handhold, its claws scrabbling for purchase, and for a moment its eyes met Kaelen's. "This changes nothing," it hissed. "We know where you're going. We know where all the humans are. We will find you. We will—" Kaelen shot it in the face. Then he turned and ran for the ship, the ground shaking beneath his feet, the vent's heat licking at his heels. Aris was screaming at him to move faster. Zelen was reaching out, her hand closing around his wrist, pulling him up the ramp as the ship lifted off, its engines straining against gravity. The last thing Kaelen saw before the cargo bay door closed was the vent collapsing in on itself, burying the raiders in a tomb of stone and fire. Then they were in the air, climbing, leaving the garden behind. The cargo bay was chaos. Children were crying, shaking, clutching each other with limbs that wouldn't stop trembling. Aris was trying to take a head count, his plasma rifle discarded, his hands shaking as badly as anyone's. Zelen was moving through the crowd, her spots a steady, calming blue, murmuring words that Kaelen's translator couldn't quite catch, and Vec was standing by the viewport, staring down at the shrinking surface of the planet, his damaged voice whispering something too quiet for anyone else to hear. Kaelen walked over to him. "You okay?" Vec didn't look away from the window. "You lied to them." "What?" "When you said the raiders didn't know we were there, you lied, or you didn't ask the right questions." Vec's reflection in the viewport was distorted, but Kaelen could see the flat, ancient weariness in those cat-slit eyes. "They've always known, Kaelen. They've been watching us for 17 years, letting us grow, letting us develop. They weren't hunting for salvage. They were farming us." Kaelen's blood went cold. "Farming?" "We're rare," Vec said. "Hybrids, most of us. Our parents were from different compact species, brought together by the research colony's isolation. The raiders realized early on that cross-species children have unique properties. Something in the way our biologies merge creates compounds that can't be synthesized, compounds that extend life, cure diseases, make the rich richer and the powerful more powerful." He finally turned to face Kaelen, and in his eyes, Kaelen saw the full horror of what the children had endured. "They were waiting for us to reach maturity," Vec said. "That's why they came back every few months, not to search, to check on their crop, to see if we were ready to harvest." Kaelen thought of the raider leader's words. "We simply allowed them to mature before harvesting." He'd assumed it was bravado, cruelty for cruelty's sake. It wasn't. "How many?" Kaelen asked. "How many children did they take before you learned to hide?" Vec's voice cracked. 23, over the years. The ones who got sick or wandered too far or were just unlucky." He paused. "The ones we couldn't protect." Kaelen closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were hard. "They're all dead now," he said. "The raiders in that vent aren't coming back." "There are others," Vec said. "The raiders are a species, not a crew. They have ships, fleets, and they know where Earth is. They've known for years, they just didn't care because Earth was irrelevant. But now, He gestured at the ship, at the children, at Kaelen himself. Now you've killed their harvest. You've taken their property. They will come for you, for all of you, and they will not stop. The words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. Kaelen looked around the cargo bay, at the children who had survived 17 years of hell, at Aris, who had risked everything to find them, at Jelen, who had led them through darkness with nothing but hope and stubborn love. He thought about the promise he'd made, about the lullaby his mother had hummed, about the raiders' laughter and the look in their leader's eyes before he'd pulled the trigger. "Let them come," Kaelen said, and in the cargo bay of a battered ship, 43 children who had learned not to believe in anything heard something in his voice that they hadn't heard in 17 years. Hope. It would be a long journey back to Earth. 17,000 light-years of empty space and limited supplies and children who needed more than he could give. The raiders would find them, or they wouldn't. Earth would welcome the children, or it wouldn't. The Compact would face consequences for their abandonment, or they wouldn't. None of that mattered right now. Right now, Kaelen Voss was flying a stolen ship full of alien children through a universe that had forgotten them, toward a home that didn't know they existed. And for the first time in 17 years, they weren't waiting anymore. They were going,